The Psychology of Totalitarianism by Matthias Desmet is a contemporary and deeply psychological exploration of how modern societies can drift into totalitarian control, not through overt tyranny alone, but through a collective psychological process. Written in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, Desmet frames his work not as a direct political treatise, but as a philosophical and psychological diagnosis of our current civilizational crisis. He argues that totalitarianism is less a historical anomaly and more a recurring symptom of mass anxiety, disconnection, and a broken relationship with reality. Desmet opens with the observation that something is deeply wrong in our culture. Even before the pandemic, people across the world were experiencing rising levels of loneliness, depression, and meaninglessness. He identifies these trends not as isolated mental health issues but as manifestations of a larger civilizational problem. The hollowing out of human life by a mechanistic and rationalist worldview that dominates modern thought. In societies increasingly driven by data, efficiency, and technocracy, human beings are reduced to numbers, and with that reduction comes a spiritual and social void. At the heart of Desmet's thesis is the concept of mass formation, a psychological process by which isolated and anxious individuals become absorbed into a collective identity. Unlike typical crowd behavior, mass formation is long-lasting, ideological, and emotionally charged. It provides people with a sense of purpose and solidarity, but at the cost of critical thinking and individuality. Once people enter this state, they become highly susceptible to propaganda, censorship, and authoritarian policies, not because they are coerced, but because they desire belonging and certainty. Desmet traces the conditions necessary for mass formation. Social atomization, loss of meaning, free-floating anxiety, and a lack of clear direction. These conditions, he argues, are rampant in the modern world, where digital technologies and technocratic systems isolate people from community and narrative. When a crisis appears, whether it's a pandemic or a political threat, this latent anxiety finds a focal point, and people eagerly embrace simplistic explanations and solutions, no matter how destructive. What follows, Desmet explains, is the emergence of a totalitarian dynamic, not necessarily driven by a tyrant, but by the crowd itself. In classical totalitarianism, such as in Nazi Germany or Stalinist Russia, the state imposed ideology from the top down. In modern totalitarianism, it is often the masses who demand ever more control, surveillance, and punishment for dissenters. Desmet calls this a totalitarianism from below, where the psychological needs of the population give rise to an authoritarian system sustained by groupthink and moral absolutism. The role of science and technology in this process is one of Desmet's most important critiques. He argues that the Enlightenment's dream of rational progress has morphed into a dogmatic belief in science as an infallible authority. When complex realities are reduced to models, statistics, and slogans, the nuances of life, and the human capacity for doubt and ethical judgment, are lost. Scientific reductionism becomes not a method of inquiry but an ideological weapon, used to justify increasingly rigid policies and suppress dissent. Desmet is particularly critical of how dissenting voices are treated in such systems. In a society under mass formation, critics are not debated or engaged, they are scapegoated, labeled, and excluded. This intolerance is not driven solely by malicious elites, he insists, but by ordinary people who are psychologically dependent on the dominant narrative. The presence of dissent is intolerable because it threatens to expose the constructed nature of the system in which they have invested their psychological security. Despite this bleak diagnosis, Desmet does not advocate for despair or passivity. He believes that the key to resisting totalitarian tendencies lies in reclaiming meaning, truth, and genuine human connection. He emphasizes the importance of speech, not merely as a right, but as an existential necessity. Speaking truth, even when it goes unheard or is punished, maintains an individual's integrity and has a rippling effect on the collective unconscious. Silence, on the other hand, allows false systems to grow unchecked. Desmet also calls for a re-evaluation of our relationship to science. Rather than abandoning it, he advocates for a return to what he calls real science, an open-ended, humble inquiry that accepts uncertainty and values the subjective experience of human life. He contrasts this with what he terms mechanistic science, which sees humans as biological machines and ignores the soul, the psyche, and the narrative dimension of reality. A society that denies mystery, he argues, will always drift toward control. Philosophically, Desmet draws from thinkers like Hannah Arendt, Gustave Le Bon, and Michel Foucault, combining their insights with psychoanalysis and systems theory. He situates totalitarianism not just as a political regime but as a psychological structure that emerges when a society loses its symbolic anchors. Without stories, without rituals, and without a sense of transcendence, people become vulnerable to the seduction of false certainty and collective ecstasy. The book becomes especially urgent when Desmet applies his ideas to the response to COVID-19. He does not deny the reality of the virus but critiques how the crisis was framed and managed. In his view, the relentless messaging of fear, the suppression of nuance, and the public's willingness to tolerate extreme measures all revealed how deeply mass formation had taken root. He sees the pandemic not as a singular event, but as a lens through which deeper patterns of control and alienation were made visible. Importantly, Desmet makes a distinction between totalitarianism and classical dictatorship. The danger today, he argues, is not the rise of a new Hitler, but the slow, well-meaning slide into a society where individuals willingly surrender their freedom in exchange for safety and clarity. Totalitarianism in the 21st century is soft, bureaucratic, and digital, more Kafka than Orwell. It is not marked by open violence but by invisible conformity. In response, Desmet advocates for the cultivation of inner freedom, the ability to stand firm in uncertainty, to think independently, and to maintain a connection to what is real and human. He believes that even small acts of honesty and courage can crack the facade of totalitarian control. This is not a romantic call to rebellion but a sober recognition of how resistance begins, with the preservation of speech, doubt, and empathy. By the end of The Psychology of Totalitarianism, the reader is left with a haunting but empowering message. Totalitarianism is not just an external threat, it is a psychological tendency that exists within all of us and within the structures we create. Its antidote is not found in revolution or ideology, but in the hard, slow work of building meaningful relationships, thinking clearly, and staying rooted in moral and existential truth. Desmet's book is a philosophical and psychological wake-up call. It offers no easy answers, but it clarifies what is at stake in an age dominated by systems, screens, and fear. His vision is one that urges readers not to fight power with power, but to restore the human spirit where it has been hollowed out. In doing so, he reframes the struggle against totalitarianism as a deeply personal, and deeply human, act of resistance.